more exciting throughout the day. So, oh my gosh, what a big room, and I'm not going to be able to see. I'm going to have to do this a lot to see you guys. So, it's the last session of the day. Has it been a long day for you guys? A good one? Are you going to go home and code or sleep or drink Kingfisher beer? Oh, what a long day. All right, so I have this great habit of, taking these 50-minute presentation slots and wanting to code up entire applications from scratch. So, but I have a secret of how I can get through them now. So what I want to do today is talk about moving away from demoware applications. Does everybody know what I mean when I say demoware? It's the pretty applications that Microsoft shows you how to use that are good for keeping track of your your CDs. I always age myself when I say that. So it's just little applications that really aren't good for the enterprise. And what I want to do is take my favorite technology, of course, Entity Framework, and show you the MVC3 tooling was just updated at last week's Mix conference in Las Vegas. And it's pretty slick. It incorporates Entity Framework and makes it so that you don't even, all you have to do is give it classes and it just, boom, writes the whole application for you with Entity Framework, which is really, really handy. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how that works because, it is great for a demo. And it's a good way to get started, too, if you've never seen any of the technology. Then what I'm going to do is start tearing it apart and moving things around to show you how you can start restructuring things to make it more of an architectural application, right? It's for enterprise. Since it's probably not doable, not possible to write a whole beautifully architected enterprise application in 50 minutes, unless there's somebody here who can. If you can, quick, come down. No? Okay. So what I'll do is I'll get started with that. Then I'm going to flip over to one that I've already done all the work. And besides using the new MVC3 tooling that just got released, I'm also going to be using Entity Framework 4.1, which is an addition to Entity Framework 4. So Entity Framework 4 is what you get out of the box with Visual Studio 2010 and .NET 4. And Microsoft just recently, it was officially released at the same time at the conference, the Mix conference. They recently released this addition to it, which gives us two things. One is a DB context, so it's a simpler way of coding against Entity Framework, and the other is code first, so the ability to do, if you don't want to have a physical visual model to work with Entity Framework, you can just start with code classes. Now, I've done this demo in the past where I've started with a model and a database and entity objects, and it was a lot more work to do this shifting around. Code first, if it makes sense for you to start with code and you don't have a database to reverse engineer or whatever, code first actually is a really good head start for doing this. It makes it a lot easier because we don't have all these ties that bind us into Entity Framework. So that's a little bit about me, but it pales in comparison to your lovely introduction. Thank you again. So before I dig into this, I just want to make sure you're aware of some of the tools that came to us with Entity Framework 4 that's going to make it possible for me to do what I'm going to do, which is to make a better architecture in the application. One of the things that the Entity Framework team gave us was persistence ignorance. Okay? And what that means is that the classes, the domain classes, the core classes of your application are not, or let's just use the term, are ignorant of how they're persisted. They don't care where they come from. They don't care if it comes from a database or if it comes from an entity data model or if it comes from an XML file. They're just classes. So they're totally ignorant of their persistence. And with the ability that we have now to have classes that are not so strongly tied to the Entity Framework, which is what we had in the first version, it lets us start separating things in our application so we can break things apart, build more maintainable and reusable code and testable code. So who here does testing, unit testing, or any kind of automated testing? Great. Maybe a few more will adopt it after today, because I'm one of those people like, oh, if Julie can do it, anybody can do it. And I've been learning. So one of the ways we get this persistence ignorance is through some interfaces, some set interfaces that we've got in Entity Framework, and that's also in 4.1. And the other is to have not only the classes that are ignorant of their persistence, but they're also not tied into other frameworks. These are called POCOs, or plain old CLR objects. If you're familiar with the previous version of Entity Framework, all the classes that were generated inherited from Entity Framework's entity object. And right there is where kind of the road ended for testability and a lot of reusability, because your core domain classes were now part of Entity Framework in a way, instead of, they shouldn't have anything to do with that. They should, Entity Framework should manage those classes, but they shouldn't be aware of Entity Framework. So this allows that to happen. So how do we get the POCOs? There's a couple. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so used to pacing. I didn't just realize I'm standing in front of there. There's a number of, there's 3 ways now. If we start with a database, so who here has reverse engineered a database using database first to create an entity data model? So you probably, that's the one you've seen the demo of, many times. So Entity Framework, in the new version, we have T4 templates. So the templates are what .NET uses, or Visual Studio uses, to generate the classes from that entity data model. And earlier, with the first version, we didn't have any control over them, how that code was generated. But they switched over to using these T4 templates, which stands for, like, if you care, Text Template Transformation Toolkit. Okay, I have to take a bow for that's always hard for me. So the templates allow us to have a lot more control over the generated code. We can change them to do whatever we want. So what happens is T4 reads the model, reads the XML of the model, and reads the instructions in the template, and then generates classes based on that. So you can write your own, but Microsoft did give us 2 key ones that we can work with. One creates simple POCOs, and there's a new one that creates POCOs that go along with this new Entity Framework 4.1 DB context that just got released. So with a combination of a model, whether you do it database first or you create model first, but a physical model and a T4 template, we can get to these simple classes. And I'm a little dissatisfied with what the screen has done to the resolution of my slides, because you really just can't see them. Hopefully, I don't think it will impact what the code looks like. These are just screenshots, but this is a screenshot of a model, and that's a screenshot of just some simple classes. They just have a couple of properties in them, and there's nothing about Entity Framework in there. They're just simple. So one way to get to them is through a model plus T4 templates, and the other way is just to start with the classes using code first, not having a model at all. So Entity Framework gives us a whole bunch of ways to create POCO classes, whether we start with a model or we start with the classes themselves. So that's all new also, but it gives us a lot of power. The fact that these classes do not inherit from entity object, I'm sorry that it must be hard to see back there, is where that power originates. There's another important piece of this is how Entity Framework does, the important piece of how we're able to start separating things is how Entity Framework is able to do change tracking. So Entity Framework, a number of things that it does. It gives us this object relational mapping so that we don't have to worry about what the database looks like, and we can write queries and just get the objects back really easily. The other thing it does, it keeps track of any changes we make to those objects. Then we have this really one method called save changes, and it'll just take all those changes and push them back to the database. So the way that that was originally working with Entity Framework 3.5 was that because all of our classes inherited from the entity object notified the context of any changes that were happening. And that's how the context was able to keep track of what's going on in there, that inheritance. But that inheritance was creating problems for creating better architectures. So as of, bad color, sorry about that. Now with POCOs, what happens is the context itself that manages that state is smarter. And the context, rather than waiting for the objects to tell it what's happening, the context knows how to read the objects. So it'll update what its idea of the state is. So it knows, it's okay, it started out with this piece of data, and now it has this piece of data. There's a third way that's supported. It's called dynamic proxies. And you still have your POCOs, but they act like entity objects. At runtime, Entity Framework creates wrappers around the instances, so they know how to notify the context. So that's how we're able to get away with these two new ways. We're able to get away from having our domain classes inherit from entity object, and we can start really having separation of concerns. So that's another one of the really important things that was added in Entity Framework, the fact that the context is able to either read the objects on its own, or we have these runtime proxies so that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have POCOs, and still the context knows what's going on with them, even though they aren't inheriting from entity object. So I'm going to just go ahead and I'm just going to actually create a brand new application here. So I'll start with creating an MVC3 application. Yeah, there's the new resolution. That's nice. And there's the MVC3 template. So I'll start with that, and that'll give me my project, my solution. And I'm just going to use the defaults. I won't worry about them too much. What I'm more interested in is what this spits out for us, right? What we get in the end. Whoa. My computer's feeling tired. Okay. I would have been happier if I created an empty project, but this is fine. That took a really long time. All right, so what it did was it just created a basic project, an MVC project, and we've got a place for our M, which is our models, a place for our V, which is our views, and a place for our C, which is our controllers. Now what I want is, I have my own model, and that model is my domain classes. And so I'm going to add them into this solution. And yeah, I'll add the project in so you can see the classes. And they are here. You might have seen them if you were in my last session. So this is what I call a model, right? And this is code first. With database first and model first, what I call a model is that visual model. But when I'm working with code first, my model is my classes. They describe what the model of my domain is. So it's just a simple blog class and a simple post class. There's nothing else going on here. So here's the magic of the new MVC3 toolkit, the update that was just released for the tools. I'm going to go into my controllers, and I want to create a controller for the blogs, right? So I want my MVC application to let me work with blogs. So I'm going to create a controller that will be in charge of blogs. So I'll add controller. I'll call it the blog controller. And before I can do that, I have to build the project so that the wizard is able to find the classes that I just referenced. Oh, I didn't reference them. That would help. There we go. And then I have to build them. Okay, so now I'll create the controller. And I'm going to use this template, which is the controller with read-write actions and views using Entity Framework. So if you've been using MVC3 and you haven't seen the update to the tools, that's what's new. So I'm going to create, all I'm going to do is feed it the classes. It's going to do all the rest of the work. Okay? So what class do I want it to build this controller for? The blog class. And it says what data context class. So a data context class is the one that's going to be in charge of managing the relationship between my classes and the database. Okay? So I don't have a data context class, so I'm going to say, create one for me. I don't feel like writing all that code. Just giving it a smaller name, a shorter name. And I'll click Add. I'll just leave the other defaults there. And let it code for me. I love this. See, all this new stuff is getting added in there. It's great. Now, you saw me create this project from scratch. Did you see me put a connection string in? No connection string. I'm using code first. By default, if I don't provide a connection string, code first will say, all right, well, I didn't find anything, so I'm going to create something in SQL Express for you. So I can go ahead and run this. Oh, and this is going to the default controller. I want to change this to my controller. Didn't I rename that to blog? Blog controller. So this is just the way the... Yes. Let me just make sure this looks the way I want it to. Log controller, excellent. So by default, MVC3 always says that it wants you to start with the home controller. So I have to change it to point to my controller. Even if I used an empty template and didn't get the home controller and the account model controller, it would still say home there. Rename. I should have just left it called default. So MVC has a lot of assumptions. So its assumption was, okay, if the controller is the blog controller, then I'm going to look for views inside of a blog folder. So that's why I had to change that. So there, my application's running. I'll go ahead and create a new blog. And I'll just call it blog Julie 4/1/2011. Create. There's my blog. So I'm getting my database interaction. I'm just going to create another one. I have a reason. It's not going to be as creative as the first. Okay. So that was really great, right? I just really clicked a couple things and got the application. There's one more piece of this I want to show you because I think it's important. I'm going to do the same thing very quickly for the posts. And so I'll add another controller. I'll name it this time post controller. And I'm going to say use posts. And I'll say add. And it's going to do all that work again. But there will be one difference. I got to wait for it to finish. And I was going to say drum roll, please, and the thunder was like pretty good timing for that. Okay, so it created the blog controller for me when I asked it. It created the post controller. But the first time, you remember I said, please add a context for me? It created this blog context. And the second time, and this is what it put inside of the blog context, a way to interact with the blogs. The second time, it gave me a way to interact with the posts. So I can go here. It didn't go back to the views and build a link between the blog and the post, but I've got that up my sleeve. Okay, so I'm just going to go directly to post. And I just wanted you to see this. It even built in, like all that automated stuff, even built in like this cross-referencing so I can say what blog it's for, right? So that's what we get out of the box. And a lot of, and you'll probably find presentations where that's the presentation, just a little more time spent on everything, right? Look how great this tool is. It wrote everything for me. You don't have to do any work. But really, look at what it wrote for me. It put all this stuff in the nice separate places. But if we look in the controllers, what it's doing in the controllers is directly accessing my entity framework context, right? So if I wanted to do any unit testing against my controller, I'm always going to hit the database, right? And if I want to make any changes to how the controller works, or if I want to make changes to how my data context works, everything's really bound together. I have to, go here and change something, go there and change something. Things are not separated very well. And as a matter of fact, I want to show you that this application is very dependent on entity framework. The UI, right? My user interface, what does the user interface have to do with entity framework? It shouldn't have anything to do with entity framework. But it won't run if I don't have that reference to entity framework in there. Really dependent on entity framework. So what I want to do is take that, but I'm going to take a cleaner version of it. Please let it be right there. No, it's not right there, of course. It is in here. Okay, I'll start there. All I've done with this is built some more linking in so you can navigate from posts to blogs or from blogs to posts. So that's just some, MVC. That's really just doing some work in the views and a little in the controller. That's not architectural. It's just more visual and user interface kind of stuff. So I'll just show you that working. Pokey. Okay, so this is pointing to a different database because it made just because I named things differently. But now see, I can navigate to the posts. That's actually, there was a whole bunch of work. I would not have been able to do that very quickly to put that in. But it's really more about some changes to the views more than anything. And then I can go back to blogs. That's really all that I did there. So now what I want to do is start moving things around. So the thing that I complained a lot about already was the fact that these controllers are interacting with the entity framework data context directly, and I'd really rather they didn't. So the first thing I want to do is take these, let's go to the controller. I'll just focus on the post. So I want to take this stuff out of there. I don't want it creating a blog context, instantiating that, and interacting with it directly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new layer into here. I'm not going to put it in another project, only for simplicity. I'll just throw it in here. And I'll show you something where things are broken out into all of their projects also. So I have my class here. Just easier. Whoop. Okay, so what I've done here is I've got something that I call a repository. The repository is going to be, there's different ways of perceiving a repository. This one is going to be responsible for posts. Okay, so it has methods like get all posts for a particular blog, get a particular post by its ID, delete a post, update a post. So in this particular class, this is where I'm going to do my interaction with the data access. I'm not going to do it right in the UI. And really I'll want to move this repository class. I don't even want it in the same project as the MVC project. I want it in a kind of a business logic project, or maybe my data access project. So then what I can do is go back to this post controller, and instead of working directly with this blog context, do I have to? No. Back to my post repository. Oh, I have to reference data access, and it's post repository, so that's good. Private post. Who wants to come and be my typer? I've actually done this before, where I just stand and walk around the stage and tell somebody how to do the typing. That is really fun to do. Okay, so I'll call that rep for repository equals new post repository. Okay, so I'm going to replace my code that accesses the database context with that post, with the repository. So the UI will work with the repository now. So now we've got a layer of separation between the UI and my actual data access layer. And is that a good thing in your minds, like for people who have been thinking a lot about architecture? So it's a step in the way, step in the right direction. There's still more to go. So what I want to do here is, instead of calling db post, I'm going to say repository get posts for blog, and then pass in the blog ID. Sometimes these wonderful third-party tools help you a little too much, because I'm used to typing in the parens myself, and it wants to put them in there for me. Okay, so there's the first one. Right? Now the index is not interacting with that. I won't be able to run this unless I change these others. So I'll do this. Get post by ID. No, get post. And then ID. Yes, it's helping me way too much. Okay, any more? You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to move these out of here, the create and the edit and everything, because you get the concept of what I'm doing. I'm just going to do that for now. Where did it go? Var post equals rep dot get post by ID. I think who I need is a Mark Miller typer, although this isn't his tool. There. Okay, so now those two will use the repository. And there's one more piece in here in the repository that I need to address, which is this constructor. And I've set this up because I want to have some flexibility here. Okay? I'll show you the flexibility in a minute, but I'm going to pass the context. Actually, in this case, I'm not going to. I'm just going to do that for now. I'll show you in a minute why. This is where I need the thunder again. Okay, So I've done this shift. I'm now using the repository in my controller and not the data access class, and it still just works. And well, that's the blog still just works. Let's see if the post still just works. Yes. So it's the post that I changed, right? The post controller is using my post repository. So I've got this first bit of separation done in there. And let's see, which other one did I enable? I think I enabled details. Yeah, I enabled details to work. There was my thunder. Okay, you didn't steal my thunder. So, 40. All right. So the next thing I want to do, this is great, and a really, really good first start. But the next thing I want to do is make this flexible so that I can do unit testing. All right? And one of the problems with unit testing when you have data access code is if your tests are triggering database activity, it stops being a test of your unit, of your class, and it becomes a test of entity framework's capabilities and the database interaction. Right? It becomes an interaction test. It's not a unit test anymore. If I want to just test my classes and not have the interaction with the database, I need to break things apart one layer further. Okay? Do you follow me? I'll pretend I can see you and that you're all nodding your heads going, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so what I want to do is add in, I'll back up a little bit. Here's what I'm going to change. All right? In .NET, where we can really get flexibility is with interfaces instead of concrete classes. And so that's what I want to change. Right now, my repository, anytime I want to work with a repository, whether I'm using it in my actual application or I'm using it in unit tests, right now it's bound and tied to the blog context and therefore entity framework and the database. Okay? And so that's the next thing I want to change. I want to make that more flexible. So instead of using this concrete class, the blog context, I want to use an interface. And I'm just going to drag and drop that in here because I made that, didn't I? Public interface. iBlog context. So I want the interface to have the same knowledge that my blog context has. My blog context knows how to expose DB sets of, here I'll go back over to the blog context class. This is nothing compared to how many projects I had in the other one, in the last demo. My blog context class got created in here. So this is what I need it to be aware of. I need it to know how to expose blogs. I need to be able to query, right? I need my context to be able to say, go get blogs or go get posts. So I would put those in there. And now the blog interface has the knowledge of blogs and posts. There's a few things I would do here instead. Use another interface for more flexibility here. And also apply some of the critical methods that my context needs. So the context, I need to be able to call save changes, but I won't be able to now unless I have save changes in my iBlog context. So I would create a property, a method called save changes. And that's going to return an int just like. And yes, no public there. How come you guys weren't telling me? Okay, so I'm not going to keep going with this one. What I'm going to do is, having shown you these pieces, I'm going to flip over to the fleshed out application so you can see how all this stuff comes into play in an application where I've really done all the work. But I just wanted you to see how I'm doing some of the shifting. And what I would do here now with my repository, instead of expecting a blog context, I'm going to pass in, I put that constructor back in and expect the interface. So I'm going to flip over to a more architected application, which now we can shift to with all the new tools we have, and you've seen some of that now, especially like the interfaces we didn't have, the IObjectSet interface we didn't have before. So now what I have is this solution. You can see it's got a lot more separation even with the layers of the projects. So here is the first one. And that's just my classes. This one happens to use code generation and a model. This one doesn't use the code first, but it's the same concept. So this is where my classes are that are my domain. That's in that project. And these are POCOs, and they're persistent ignorant. And if we look at the references, you'll see there's no system.data.entity or entity framework in there. So these are totally unaware of entity framework. Here's my model. And my interface, there's my context interface, right? I had iBlog context before. This time it's called iContext. And this interface has a lot more things in it that it does. Well, first of all, it has a lot more entity sets that it returns, or sets that it returns. And notice they're all interfaces, so we've got the flexibility. And it implements a bunch of methods, or it creates a bunch of methods to be implemented. So rather than duplicating save changes from entity framework, I have my own save method. And when I'm using an implementation of this that happens to be the real entity framework blog, then I'll call save, when save will then call save changes. I also have some other just nice methods that I wanted to add in here. We'll see them in action in a bit. Now here's something I added in. This is going to help me if I'm building this for a disconnected application. So I'm not going to focus on this too much, but that's why that's in there. And here are my repositories. Now I only built one of the repositories just now. Now I have repositories for each of the domain, each of the focuses of my domain. So here it's really per class, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So the repositories, first I want to point out the constructor of the repositories. Notice that the constructor of the repositories takes either an iContext, so it takes my context interface, or this other thing called a unit of work. If I don't use this overload of the constructor, then it will just assume that I want to use a concrete class. So they all work like that. And you can see there's a whole bunch of, I've got interfaces all over the place so that I can pull this off. So my repositories look like that. I also have another layer called the unit of work. So the unit of work lets me actually share. If I want to have relationships between things, you notice that my controllers were all the repositories were for each class. But if those classes have relationships with each other and I want them to be recognized, then I need to share the context from one repository to another so that they become joined, so that they understand how to navigate with each other, and queries will work and updates will work too. So I have this way of sharing the context by wrapping the whole repository inside of a unit of work. So that will be my core. And I use a variety of patterns in here to enable this, so that it can pass things around. Now if we look down here, here's my little user interface. It's nothing more than a console app. And notice that it doesn't have any information about entity framework in here either. There's no references, right? That was important to me. I didn't want the UI. What does the UI have to do with data access, right? Absolutely nothing. So there's no data access in there. And then finally, as an alternative to the UI, I have a bunch of tests. All right? So what I want to do is just run through a couple of the tests, and not only the test, but inside of this test project, I have other contexts that inherit from that implement my interface. This is what gives me the flexibility with the unit testing. So if I want to unit test and I don't want to use the real blog context that actually works with a database, I can use another class that implements the interface. Okay? So I actually created a few others. There's one called fake context. The most important thing about this is that it implements my iContext interface. That means I can create one of these and pass it into my repository. My repository will know how to work with this because it's an iContext. But this doesn't hit the database. This creates all of its own data. If you scroll down here, you can see where it's creating its data. Right? So this is where I can start doing unit testing without having to hit the database. So I can run my application. I can say I want to use a context, but I don't want to use the blog context that touches the database. I want to use my fake context that uses just my fake data so that I can have cleaner unit tests. All right, so for people who have been testing and looking at Entity Framework, wondering how to put all this together, does that make sense to you? Okay. Because I know, not everybody has done that kind of stuff, so this is pretty new. And my goal, my aim is, for those of you who are familiar with the ideas of repositories and testing and things like that, you can see how Entity Framework plugs into your patterns. And for those of you who've never done any of this kind of stuff before, it might be a little overwhelming at first to see all this, but hopefully, in the end, when we look at how this works, you might be inspired to start thinking more about how we're architecting these things. Now, I have to say, when I was doing all the work with the first version of Entity Framework, there were a lot of people who they really use a lot of very good design practices and design patterns, and they looked at Entity Framework and said, Entity Framework won't let me code the way I want to code. I can't write repositories. I can't test. I can't do anything. And you may have heard of some of that. There was the alt.NET community, and there was they all signed a petition saying Entity Framework was terrible and evil. So because of that, not because of them, but because Entity Framework didn't support this type of architecture, and I was so much working with Entity Framework, I wasn't doing any of this stuff. Then Entity Framework 4 came out, and I wanted to start doing this. And the reason was I wanted to prove to all those people who had been screaming about how horrible Entity Framework was because you couldn't unit test with it and you couldn't build decent architectures with it. I wanted to prove to them that, look, you can now, right? I had a lot of learning to do, and in fact, it was a lot of those same developers who helped me. But so, again, aiming at those of you who this is like really new to, and you're like, why would I even want to do this? I have to tell you from my own personal experience, once I started thinking this way and thinking about the repositories and thinking about separation of concerns, every time I started, I sat down to implement some logic in my application, unit testing in there, I was actually really, it changed the way I approach creating applications, right? And I'm not like an evangelist for testing and all this stuff. I'm just saying, if you've never done this and you're sitting here going, this is a lot of extra code and da-da-da, why am I looking at all this? I feel like one of those people in the commercials on TV, like, I tried it and it changed my life. What do you think? Yeah? Was it worth it? So let me run a little bit of this so you can see some of it stepping through. And the way I'm going to run this, instead of starting with UI, because now I realize the UI that's the last thing you're going to write in your application, right? So I want to make sure my logic works rather than writing a UI just to make sure my code works, because that's not what my UI is for. My UI is for writing the interface for my users, not the interface for me to make sure my code works. So instead, I've written some tests to make sure that the logic works. I've got a bunch of them, but I will... Don't I have a bunch of them in this one? Yeah, here's reservations is one of the things. This model it's for making trips, right? So you can go on a tour, make a reservation, make payments, choose what activities you want to do. So I wrote a bunch of tests that test the logic of the different things, the repositories that I wrote. So that what they're doing is really testing the repositories and to make sure my repositories and my classes are doing the right thing. They're not for testing the UI, and they're not for testing the database. I just want to make sure that when I call, I have a method called reservation, get reservations for a customer. And that tests, that one does a validation. If I look at if I go to that, it checks to make sure that I passed in a good ID. A good ID, it's not null, right? It's there and it's not null. Now, if I wanted to test this and I was tied to the database, if I just wanted to test it that validation is working, I just want to make sure that's working. I don't want it to go hit the database, right? If it fails, that's great. It'll go to this throw, it'll stop, and we'll be done. But if I pass in something good, because I should test that it also goes forth when I give it a good ID, right? So if I pass in a good ID, I can't say, oh, but after you check that the ID is good, don't do that next line of code. I don't want you to go hit the database. You can't do that, right? That's why I want to have that fake context. I don't want to hit the database, so if I can't avoid hitting this in my test if I'm passing in a good ID. So rather than worrying, well, how am I going to avoid hitting this or hitting the database, what I'll do is use my fake context that doesn't hit the database. And so that's what's happening in this particular test. There's actually a pair. That makes sense. There's one that says if I pass as ID of 0, it will throw. Not throw up, but just throw. It'll throw an exception. The other test says if I pass something greater than 0, it doesn't throw an exception, right? And so those are my tests. So I can run these tests. Thanks, I see. I'm just going to go on for a couple more hours, though. Okay. The note, the sign says it said 1 hour left. My eyes are in really bad shape. It said 1 minute left. Okay, so I want to run the test. I should have debugged it instead of ran it. Well, let's just see if it's all green. Okay, but what I really want to do is debug this test. So let's go here and debug. They're getting the hook. But this is the best part. We want to see the green lights, right? Okay, it's working. I don't care about IntelliTrace. Okay, so here we are. I create a new fake context, and I'm going to pass it into my reservation repository. Now, reservation repository doesn't care if I give it a blog context or a fake context or a lunar Mars context. Just so long as it implements iContext, it's happy. So I'm going to pass that in. And come on. Where's my... They're hiding. Okay. Now I'm going to pass in a good ID, so I want this to work. I want it to not throw. That's all I care about. It doesn't throw an exception. And so I will hit that. It says, yeah, that was good, so I'm going to go on to that next line of code. Oh, I don't care. And now I'm in my fake context, and it's doing the query, right? It's executing the query, but in the fake context, the query is something, this is what the query brings back. Not a database result, but it brings back these object instances that I create. And then the whole thing passes. Okay? So I have a whole bunch of different tests in there like that. I actually have this up on my website. You can download and you can really look at it in more detail and look at the different tests. I have validation in there, and so in my unit tests, I check to make sure that my validation code works. And when I say validation in this case, before I save changes, I want to make sure that the state of all my classes, all my objects is valid. So hopefully this gives you, again, for two different camps. Those of you who are architecting applications this way already and wondering how on earth you could possibly do it with that horrible entity framework and its entity objects, you can do that now because we have all these new tools, so it lets us architect much cleaner applications. There were 3 people over here who raised their hands about unit tests. That's why I'm going, okay, over here, and then everybody else. But I know you're all dispersed all over the place. So for those of you who have never done any of this before, I hope it tweaks your interest into thinking about expanding your architectures with your applications instead of just taking that demoware code that is automatically generated and it just works. It's really great, but if you're writing anything more than a way to keep track of your MP3 collection or whatever, if you're writing this, is that why you guys are here? Or are you work at corporations and write enterprise applications? Probably enterprise? Yeah? Okay, so that's why you want to really think about going to this next step and building applications where you've got separation of concerns and unit testing. And thankfully, we can do that and use entity framework at the same time. So that's my message. And I hope that you'll take it and run with it. And if anybody has any questions, whether it's the experts who want to, curious about a little more about the repositories or something, or the people who are new to this who have some questions about it, I'll hang around here for a little bit. Because are there any more sessions? This is it? So I can hang around here for a little while and answer questions. So thank you very much.